Okay, good afternoon. My name is Andre Walton. I'm a social psychologist by training, and I currently stationed in Reno, Nevada, but up until 6 months ago I was based in Portugal. My passion is clearly creativity. My focus really has, my PhD work and so forth, was in an organizational setting. But I'm thinking that the things that I'm going to be talking about are really pretty much applicable to non-organizational concepts within creativity. I've always kind of liked this phrase, really, that I think it's, although it's about discovery, I think it's quite applicable to the idea of creativity. The fact that it consists of seeing what everybody has seen and thinking what nobody has thought. In other words, departing from the comfort of the group norm and therefore the group thought to demonstrate your individuality. I've just spent the last sort of 6 weeks camping by a very pretty little lake in California with my 1- and 3-year-old granddaughters. And while it's been a totally exhausting exercise, it's also been very rewarding, and in many different ways. And for instance, I'll be chit-chatting to one of them, or maybe making some lunch for them or something, and I'll be told, Grandpa, it's time we went and did our swimming lessons. Oh, okay. We need to put on our swimsuits then. No. And then within a few seconds, I'm spread-eagled on the grass outside, practicing my breaststroke, you know. Or I'm in the middle of a conversation, and suddenly she'll pick up a piece of cooking equipment, put her finger up as a, yes, she thinks she's a doctor. This is Dr. Raindrop. No, I can't see you this afternoon, I'm swimming. I'll see you tomorrow, you know. And the bottom line for me is, after seeing this for weeks and weeks and weeks, it's just wonderful to see how totally unconstrained imagination can exist. And indeed, I'm feeling that some of the boundaries, I'm doing a lot of writing right now, and some of the boundaries, for me, are dropping off. I mean, I'm sort of beginning to open, it's becoming normal for me to be thinking that the obvious is suddenly the non-obvious, and vice versa. So one of the things that I do in my consulting work, which is basically to help organizations become more innovative, is more and more I'm finding I am looking at ways of reducing the barriers to creativity. Because I think one of the lessons that I get from the last few weeks and so forth is that we were once all very creative. And obviously it depends on your definition. I'm not in love with the traditional novel and useful kind of approach. You know, that to me has too many issues attached to it that I don't, that I think misses the point. So for me, creativity is somebody doing or thinking something they haven't done before. The actualization of that creative process I call innovation. Innovation's got to be useful. Sure, absolutely. The creative spark behind it, I think, does not have to be useful. There are all sorts of... The other problem with that definition, by the way, is, for instance, something like the laser, which was the development of the laser was by a bunch of bored physicists saying, I wonder what happens if we make light coherent. Oh yeah, we've got plenty of time after lunch, I'm not doing anything at the moment, we've got a bit of grant money to use up, and they developed the laser. They had no idea at that time that virtually every home in the developed world would have one over here for DVDs and CDs, and hospitals would be doing operations with it, and steel mills would be cutting steel, and cloth mills would be cutting cloth with their device. So at the time it was developed, it actually had no use. And so it would not have been classified as new and useful. It would have just been new. So it wouldn't have been... So to go back and recategorize it as something creative seems to me to be a bit contrived. So anyway, enough of definitions. I want to talk about a whole range of things. My excuse behind all this, by the way, is because they all have an impact on things like brainstorming, things like creative problem solving. But that is only an excuse. What I'm trying to put together is a whole range of fascinating things some of them physiological, many of them environmental, that have an impact on people being creative. And then the first thing I'm going to cover is something called the group affiliation model of creativity. And it revolves around two very important drives that all humans have. The first drive is that we need to be connected to others. We are basically group animals in essence. And indeed, Maslow considered that group connectivity to be second only to food and water for our survival. And of course, we know very well that, you know, the military and the military police in some countries and so forth are very aware of this. And when you deprive people of that connectivity, you can do them severe psychological damage. Solitary confinement is not something that most people will tolerate for very long. The other drive, which to a major extent is the antithesis of this, is that we need to be, and seem to be, individuals. We need our individuality. There was a program sort of 30 years ago on English TV about a prisoner, an ex-spy who was a prisoner in this very strange environment, and his favorite phrase was, I'm not a number, I'm a free man. So we don't like to be a number, we like to be free individual people, and we like to kid ourselves that our own individual thought processes, we're in charge of them. It's not, of course, entirely true. Social norms have a very powerful place to play, but we need to have individuality. And indeed, there is a psychotherapist going back 130 years now who wrote a book called Art and Artists. He believes that the inspiration behind, that the motivation behind artists is that they wish to be immortal. They wish their individuality to be such that it lives on after them. Now, whether or not, his name, by the way, is Rank, Otto Rank, R-A-N-K, R-A-N-K. So whether you take that on board or whether you consider that as extreme, you get the point anyway. So basically, the model I'm talking about has groupiness on one side and individuality on the other. And these two cannot coexist. Okay? It's not to say we are one or the other, but at any one moment they cannot exist, because as an individual, as somebody who is within the group, let's just say this is your weekend down going to the Harley Davidson club, it is your similarity to others that is important to you. That's the salient factor. When you're in individual mode, which is, of course, where creativity occurs, it is your difference from others that is important. That's what makes you individual. So these two cannot coexist at any particular time. Now, the intriguing thing is that if you move people deliberately away from individuality towards groupiness, you will reduce the motivation to be creative. And I've done a number of laboratory and field studies on this. And it's very interesting, it's very reliable, and it's very predictable. On the other hand, if you take groupiness away from people and allow them the space for their individuality, you will see creativity increase. The one thing that sort of should be mentioned in terms of this model is that given that people start off being, you know, sort of like my granddaughters, highly sort of able to think without structure, creativity is a cousin of anarchy. Okay, I mean, it is free thinking without boundaries, and the ability to connect areas that are as yet sort of normally unconnected. These are all wonderful to contemplate, but there are so many institutions in our society that would not feel any great benefit from that. I mean, if you were a school principal and you have 3,000 anarchists to look after. It is not necessarily the job where you're going to have too many applicants. Even within the family, you've got a family, 2, 3 kids, whatever, and they're all being highly individual. I mean, this will be like sort of juggling 3 bars of wet soap into the car at the same time to do whatever it is they've got to do. So there are many institutions in place deliberately to reduce that individuality. Even going back to the days when I was at school, and really pretty much every school in England had a school uniform attached to it, you know, a little cap and tie and all this kind of thing. I mean, people would go out of their way, especially at the girls' school, to make everything a little bit different, to try and generate individuality into their school uniforms. But the school uniform is part of the process of taking you from here to here. When people are imprisoned, they're frequently put in all the same clothes. They're given all the same food. They have to exercise all at the same time. This is, once again, reducing people's burden in terms of minimizing the anarchy. Just a quick summary. So really, creativity occurs within the tension between these two drives. The interesting thing happens. If this group has as its primary motive being creative, then you have kind of an interesting situation, because the group norms, if the group norms here heavily support creativity, you might imagine that this move from individuality to creativity is not going to be quite as severe. So in other words, all of our groups are not equally distant from our own set of norms, our own set of values. If you have a look, for instance, at the Bloomsbury group from the 20s and 30s, you know, for those of you who are not familiar with that, it's some of great artists, composers, writers in the 20s and 30s were loosely attached to the Bloomsbury group. The central core of the Bloomsbury group was really, I mean, they were just very dedicated to creative work. And if you read the sort of biographies of that, from that group, you tend to find that they spend time together, all sorts of bohemianizing, and then when the creative juices flow, they wander off, sometimes, often actually, physically wander off into the woods, or, you know, up in the hills, or to another country or whatever, to do their creative work. So it's an important kind of thing to think about. In the context of organizational creativity, if you're trying to develop more innovative processes in your organization, the key really is to try and shift the social norms of your organization closer and closer to that of supporting individuality. In other words, giving people perhaps a bit more space, not having structures in place that you don't really need, that kind of thing. There was a Nobel Prize winning author that I'm very fond of her writing. Her Nobel Prize speech, acceptance speech, sadly she was ill at the time, she wasn't able to deliver it in person, but she says, writers often ask, how do you write? With a word processor, an electric typewriter, a quill, longhand? But the essential question is, have you found a space, that empty space, which should surround you when you write? Into that space, which is like a form of listening, of attention, will come the words. The words your characters will speak. Ideas, inspiration. So, but I think she puts that very well. Anybody that's familiar with Irving Goffman, who's a sociologist from the mid-1900s, And he talks, he has a principle called dramaturgy. And he considers that the very essence of our personal being is created through conversations with people. So when I'm up here on my hind legs, I'm the actor and you're the audience. And in some way, you know, I am having an impact on your personality, hopefully a positive one. And then if we switch it round and you start asking me questions, you become the actor and I become the audience. And by that way, we have got a process of both of us adapting to and sometimes creating new social norms. Okay? Goffman goes on to say that we also all have a private self that nobody else sees. So you could consider that to be over here. And that private self, or you know, to use his analogy, he sort of also calls it the dressing room self, is sometimes a very interesting kind of phenomenon. If sometimes some awful crime occurs, and you think, well, how could that possibly be? Everybody said, you know, he or she was such a nice person, and da 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 da, and you have to sort of say to yourself, maybe the private self was very different. So the interesting thing about that is that in Goffman's dramaturgy, you see this process as being a way of moving sometimes the individuality part of it, and you certainly see it impacting the group. So all this is very dynamic. Okay, it's not sort of set in stone. One of the ways that we can look at this is through something called the social identity approach. And it's a little bit similar to Irving Goffman in some ways, but it doesn't really address quite so much of the dynamic nature. One of the things it does say is that it predicts that under stress, people will tend to gravitate and feel more connected to their in-group. And of course you saw this really after 9/11. Car antennae and you know, flagpoles outside people's houses started to sprout stars and stripes because people were beginning to feel connected to the group, the nation. And studies at that time found students saying that they felt more connected to their college or school. Churches reported higher attendance figures, and various other different signs that people were feeling more connected to their community. I mean, not entirely surprising. If you sort of wind the clock back to, you know, when we're living in caves and so forth, any threat really requires the group to come together. So it's a very primeval kind of force that we're talking about here. So just to, I wasn't quite sure really how academic to make this. So I'll sort of keep the very academic bits a bit minimized. But one of the interesting things, so threats have been shown to increase the salience of group norms, okay, as well as having people more connected to the group. So one of the interesting things that you have to ask yourself is, if this group is highly motivated towards being creative, then maybe threat has the capacity to take the individual into a more creative space. And some of the studies, some of the work that I have done suggests that that can be true under some circumstances. One of those circumstances is an interesting phenomenon from the Second World War. We're all familiar with the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. Well, the Manhattan Project required that people were completely isolated in Los Alamos, Mexico, New Mexico. And I mean, very, very isolated. They couldn't leave the campus except under extreme conditions. They couldn't have visitors. What they used to do was to pipe news through the public address system. Sometimes the news that they pumped through it was false, the original false news. And one piece of news that they pumped through at one particular point was that the Germans had already landed on the east coast of America. Now, the motivation for doing that, we assume, was that they would become more motivated to get the project done. And it was a project that required a lot of creativity right through every step if they were going to get it done. Now, it wasn't a scientific experiment, so we don't really know if that had any impact. What we do know was that it was an enormously complex project that was done in absolutely astonishingly short time. So it's unlikely it had any negative impact. So that's one circumstance. As an aside, another piece of work that I did, Mark Ronco published quite recently, was looking at what happens to groups under different sorts of stress. And without going into it in great detail, although I'm very happy to individually afterwards if you wish. One of the study one, the creativity exercise was boring, tedious uses of a brick. Okay, and then you count the uses of the brick. We're all familiar with that creativity test, right, or divergent thinking test. Totally boring. And the two circumstances under which that was done was one group were cued into believing they worked in an organization that was very successful, top of the heap, and so on and so forth. The other group were cued into believing that their company was about to go bust. We were right on the edge, we're highly threatened by competition. The interesting thing is that that additional stress reduced creativity. Study number two was similar in many ways. Study number two there specifically, everybody is cued into working for a music promotion company. Half of the group, that company is number one in the field, no problem. And the other half, they really need the next concert to be successful, otherwise they're going under. The creativity task is to maximize, to design, not design really, but to list possible ways in which the next concert can be promoted in order to maximize the success of the concert. And then, raters judged all the various different offerings. Under those circumstances, there was a statistically significant increase in creativity when those people were under stress, the ones who thought the company was going under. The second one, the problem, can mitigate the cause of the stress. So, it's really the first one you're fiddling while Rome is burning. The other one you're actually putting water on the fire. So, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I showed that in two different ways, two different studies. So, so that's pretty important. Companies now, all businesses are under some kind of stress, and often competitive stress, but many other different types of stress, regulatory stress. Perhaps there's going to be a tariff being put on our merchandise from abroad, whatever it is. So the point being that if you want people to be creative, then you've got to give them meaningful tasks if they're going to be able to, if that stress isn't going to undermine the creativity. How many of you are the sort of people who, if you've got to do a job in 2 weeks, you leave it till like the 12th day before you start anything? A couple of people are owning up to it. 3 maybe, okay. We're going to call you procrastinators, right? We're going to call you procrastinators. How many of you are the ones who you've got to do the job in 2 weeks and you actually got the job done in the first 3 days? Have any of those? Well, you're a procrastinating bunch, aren't you? We're going to call those precrastinators. Now, the interesting thing is, I told you I was going to sort of bop around a bit with different things that impact creativity. The interesting thing is that which I think is very interesting. And the kinds of reasons that have been coming up for this are that the guys at this end are at this end are all kind of stressed and freaked out, so they want to mitigate that stress and freaked outness. So they want to get it done like now, just so they don't have to think about it again. This bunch in the middle don't have either of those constraints, and they incubate. And it's a fairly recent area of research, incubation. But increasingly, it's being shown that it's a vital part of creativity. I know for myself, if I'm doing something, I'm doing a lot of writing at the moment, just writing another book, and sometimes there are sort of ideas that I know I should be able to connect, and I can't quite put them together. I can't maybe segue them or whatever. You may notice that segueing is not necessarily my strong point. But if I think about, if I've got this sort of thing going on, I'm thinking, well, if I'm going to meet the time schedule, I've got to really have that sorted out in 3 weeks. What I will do is to gather all the data, do the reading, and then stick the problem, conceptually in the top drawer and get on with something else. And then 2 or 3 weeks down the line, I'll open the drawer and fish it out again, and the problem seems to be, well, I don't even know what you were worried about. I mean, there it is. Does anybody relate to that? I see a few heads nodding. It's interesting, isn't it? It's the amazing power of our subconscious, isn't it? I mean, it's just, what is interesting is when people talk about decision-making processes, and sometimes that's intimately connected to creativity. One of the very interesting findings, this goes right back to Freud actually, but it's been verified in different ways. It's not spoken of very often. If you are making a very important decision, I mean, maybe it's something, you're going to move house, you've got another house to buy, and it's like you've got all these variables. Is it a decent school zone? Is it, it's nearer the middle of town, so I'm only going to get sort of 1,500 square feet, whereas if I was out there, I'd get, I mean, there are so many different variables. The interesting thing is that studies have shown that if you use intuition as your decision-making criterion for an important decision, you will tend to come up with a better solution than if you use this deductive kind of process. And if you've got any friends that are real estate agents, they'll tell you sometimes a cause of great frustration. I have a very good friend that's a realtor, and he was having a beer a few months ago. I mean, he was just so frustrated with these people. He'd given them lots and lots of time. He spent a week going around with all these different, nothing fitted the bill. Bumped into them a few weeks later, and they closed on a house which was nothing like the specification that they told him they wanted. I mean, they wanted a house, walking distance from the shops, blah, blah, blah. They'd ended up with a ranch, sort of way outside of town, So that's because the alternative process, which is the very deductive process, okay, sort of, well, this is the pros and these are the cons, that has been shown to produce better results with less important problem. So, which is kind of interesting, because when we start talking about intuition, I wonder if to some extent we're not talking about incubation processes. Processes, very seldom do we come across a problem where we haven't got any similarity in our history, for instance, or in the circumstances around us, somewhere in our life. And our brain's incredibly good if we give it the chance of kind of putting together these analogous circumstances. So, anyway, that's just a little bit of an aside about that. Many of you will be familiar with the various literatures on brainstorming. And when Alex Osborne came up with, for those of you not familiar with him, he was an advertising executive who in the late 30s, a very successful company, in the late 30s he conceptualized the fact that there must be a better way to get ideas from his staff. Somebody comes in with a product, they want it. How can we best spend our advertising budget? Blah, blah, blah. Usual kind of very commercially related stuff. So he came up basically with brainstorming. And his original letters and notes on this subject felt that brainstorming was going to produce 5 times as many ideas as just asking individuals to think about how best to do this. Well, it didn't come up with anything like that. It came up with typically 0.8 or 0.9 of the number of ideas. Brainstorming as it's traditionally been done, where a group of people sit around a table and come up with ideas as a group, is less successful than when individuals are sent off to do that. So it's interesting to contemplate that, isn't it? Because if you look at that in the context of the group affiliation model, you can kind of see a problem. Many different different things have been come up with, by the way, with regard to why brainstorming doesn't work. For instance, waiting. People will shout an idea across the table, and basically that is going to stall individuals' thoughts about as they're going along. Other ideas, pretty obvious, squelching. Okay, so if somebody comes up with an idea, a knee-jerk reaction from the person on the right, you know, that'll never work. You know, we tried that years ago. No way it's going to work. So you don't get the wacky ideas that you want to originally start off with. Dominating personalities. So, you know, if the boss thinks he's the one that's going to be facilitating the brainstorming session, of course, people, well, I'm not going to be saying something stupid in front of the boss. You know, this is a really bad idea. Got promotion coming in a couple of months' time. That could be the end of that. Topic fixation. Somebody comes up with an idea, and an hour later, the only thing you've talked about is that one idea. Too much physical noise. Physical noise has a significant impact on people's ability to come up with ideas, think about ideas, develop ideas. Freeloading, you know, oh, these guys are coming up with great ideas, so I'll just think about my shopping list for tomorrow. I'm not going to interrupt the flow of things. They're doing a great job. I could never do as well as that. So suddenly you opt out of the whole process. So I'm putting together really a kind of different way of doing brainstorming that tries to encompass a number of things that I've talked about today. The first is, have the problem or question circulated ahead of time. So don't wait till everybody's sitting around the table and say, this is what I want to talk about. And indeed, in my consulting work, I really try to ask companies, no, let's do the problem finding, because they will often say, well, this is what we want to do. We want you to facilitate a brainstorming session, and the brainstorming session wants to focus on this question. I say, well, are you sure it wants to focus on that question? And the example I give to them is the Swiss watch manufacturing industry. Now you imagine that you are one of the gnomes of Zurich making one of the then hundreds of different makes of Swiss watch, okay, from Rolex and Omega to Longines and all the rest of it. And, as I say, another 80 companies that some of whom don't exist anymore. And then the kids open the cereal, breakfast cereal packet one morning, and out comes a watch. I mean, do you remember the days when watches were so cheap? The original digital watches were so cheap, it wasn't even worth changing the battery. I mean, the watch was cheaper than the cost of the replacement battery. Everybody kind of remember those days. I mean, and so the Swiss watch manufacturing companies will be looking at this watch and saying, you know, it's very accurate and it's very cheap. We are in trouble. What do we do? And what do you do? I mean, what is the question? And the Swiss watch industry is actually very interesting because although effectively these different companies are in competition with each other, their industry association is so strong that they do a lot of things as a cohort. They do a lot of things that are coordinated. And this is really what they were doing at that time, when suddenly, out of the blue, they've got this enormous threat. Well, what questions could they have asked? I mean, if they had said, well, we need to come up with some great ideas. You know, if they had gone to a brainstorming facilitator and said, you know, we need to find ideas as to how we can sustain the revenue from our manufacturing watches. Okay, what would they have got? Well, the answer is who knows, because they didn't do it. But it's unlikely that they would have saved their industry. What they in fact did was they took it one stage earlier, and they went to fact finding. They went to question finding. They wanted to actually find the right question to ask in the first place. What they ended up with was reframing what they did. They no longer framed themselves as the world's best manufacturer of watches. They framed themselves as the world's best micro-engineers. And they became the world's first and best hearing aid manufacturers. A lot of those Swiss watch companies switched over to making hearing aids. Now there's a lot of competition now from other parts of the world, but for many years Switzerland was part of that process. So that's what I talk to my clients about when they think they already know the question that's to be asked. Now, having done all that, so I put the question, or I have them put the data or the question ahead of time, so that we've got this process of incubation that can happen. The second thing is I take people, if I possibly can, into a non-work environment. Because all the time you're doing all this in the corporate boardroom, you know, that's really, I mean, it's called boardroom for a reason. You know? So I take them out of that, so that we're out of that, conceptually out of that structure. And sometimes people are unconvinced. Oh, it doesn't matter. We'll just. I don't want to rent that place when we've got a perfectly good boardroom. You know. Anybody familiar with arts studies called Silence of the Library? It's an interesting study. People were two groups, and they were asked to discuss something, and then one group was just asked to discuss, I don't know, it was nothing of any consequence at all. It was how they were going to remodel the kitchen in the university, and then they were going to wander off to the kitchen to have a look at it. The others were asked to design a way in which students were going to learn how to use the library, and then they were told they were going to the library afterwards. The library group actually had their discussions 10 decibels more quietly than the ones who were talking about the kitchen. They all knew they were not actually in the library or the kitchen, but just cueing them into the fact that they were going to the library caused them to start talking much more quietly. So these things matter. These things matter. I have people, where possible, wearing their weekend clothes, because they're more likely to bring out their individuality. They express their individuality in their weekend clothes, not the boring old suit that they put on Monday to Friday. So these things do matter. They really have an impact. What I first do when we actually kind of start the session is I have people scatter. I don't want them next to each other. I don't want them talking to each other. And they come up with their ideas away from everybody else and going for a walk. And I'll tell you why the walk is interesting. There's a piece of the brain that separates the two hemispheres. It's called the corpus callosum. Anyone familiar with that? It is, from a communications point of view, it is miserably poor. I mean, this is like wet string compared to broadband. It is a really miserably, considering the complexity of the brilliance of the brain, it's quite astounding why this thing has sort of managed to survive. But there it is. And it is the only way that you can communicate across the major part of the two hemispheres of the brain. What is interesting is that kids that are taught up to about the age of 4, music, a musical instrument or something to do with music, have better developed corpus callosi throughout their lives as adults. If you are unfortunate enough not to have been taught music by 4, hope is not actually lost. because it's also been found that if you do a physically active, something physically active that doesn't require much cognitive effort, you will also get more corpus callosum activity, such as going for a walk. Such, by the way, as fiddling, tapping, you know, sort of generally kind of being annoying to everybody. You know, so when kids are sort of fiddling and tapping and fidgeting, they may in fact be improving corpus callosum activity. So that's why I have the walk. Okay, and that's why I'm sure it's apocryphal, but I mean it's a sort of known phenomenon, isn't it? If you will often come to some kind of a solution to a problem when you're, for instance, having a walk. I also make sure all the ideas are written down, so people can't cheat and sort of say, you know, oh well, yeah, that's pretty much the idea I had, you know, when it isn't, because yours now seems a bit stupid after somebody else has said them. And I actually have other people read their ideas. So when we do have the group discussion around the table, I have them switch lists of ideas. Doesn't work so well if somebody's got terrible writing, but you know, I'd rather have that than have the ideas being modified. And of course, stay upbeat. Okay, it's been I've done field studies and lab studies and positive affect all the way down the line. Every time I've done a study, I've measured affect, and mood, positive mood, and creativity go hand in hand. So, you know, even if it's a sort of dreary subject, we try and make it fun and enjoyable. So the interesting thing is, there are lots of different models as to quite how creative problem solving sort of works, but broadly, you're going to have this problem finding, ideation part of it where we actually come up with solutions, and then the implementation. And there's a lot of literature and ideas about the fact that there are different, sometimes this is in 4, but I'm not sure I'm convinced about the reason for that, so mine's in 3. That there are different kinds of personality types that become effective in each of these 3 areas. But Mike Mumford's talk yesterday kind of suggests that that may be not nearly as important as people think it is. So a few other thoughts just to throw at you. Plenty of room essential for individual creative contributions, particularly in highly structured teams. Toyota, many years ago now, introduced sort of idea boxes, and those came with the understanding that if it was a particularly good idea, that person may have a chance to lead a team to develop the idea. There's also, to some degree, a limited amount of financial reward, fairly low-level financial reward attached to it. They geared up to sort of think they were going to be dealing with, you know, a few hundred ideas a month. Well, after a couple of weeks, they were getting of the order of 5,000 a week. I mean, it was absolutely astounding how many people wanted to contribute ideas. Other things to think about. Creativity, although creativity needs space, individual level space, it also does need structure. I mean, Runco has been quite strong on this, and Sternberg's work has also contributed to it. We need a structure within which to create. So it's not really, and if you don't have that, you can get some really disastrous results. I mean, Rachmaninoff's first piano concerto was radical by that time, and it was absolutely slated by the critics. And he did 7 years of no music, nothing musical at all, culminating in a whole bunch of psychotherapy before he put pen to paper and did another composition. And basically because he was out of touch with his audience. So he was miserably unprepared for the fact that they did not share his enthusiasm for this new process. Of course, he was way ahead of his time, but he paid a high price for it. Keep focused on the direct and positive contribution of creative product. But over and over again, I've seen in my consulting work that when companies are display, and I stress to people this should be in the strategic plan as well as the goals and the mission of the company, that it's supportive of creativity. And increasingly, that is absolutely critical, isn't it, to corporate success. So a part of that is also that you have to weave into the process that it's okay to fail. Okay? If you're not going to try, you're not going to get any kind of activity. If you have a look at the attempts that were made by some of the amazing, famous composers of our time, you are talking about thousands and thousands of attempts. If you look at the great, from Beethoven to Mozart to Wagner, particularly, you're talking about documented. We don't have the contributions that they created. Sometimes they're just so disgusted they threw them away. Others just accidentally got dumped into the dumpster. But we know from other writings that they typically produced thousands and thousands of attempts. So over and over again, creativity is the result of a continual process of attempting things. So the more that companies are happy to let their employees do that without being chastised, then the more positive output we're going to be getting. Don't hesitate to let me know if you want me to send you any of the sort of backup research of anything that I've mentioned there. And thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions.